This is a presentation on one of the features from the next batch that we'd like to deliver. So this is spaces. We talked a lot about spaces earlier this year, but quite a few new people have started since then. And also the feature isn't exactly what we originally talked about either. So this is a chance to go through it. And unfortunately, with spaces comes the troll under the bridge, which is permissions as well. So we'll have a quick look at that too. So of the three themes for 2018, spaces is dealing with scaling Octopus. So this helps people with large amounts of data to manage it in a better way. So what's the problem? The problem is that in Octopus, everything is global. So projects, environments, life cycles, you name it, you share it. So in these big organizations with many disparate teams, all their peas and carrots are mixed together. And this doesn't just present, it's not just a challenge from the UI for them managing their data, it's also a performance concern because it makes it difficult for us to segregate what we fetch from the server, for example. So the answer is spaces. So the idea of a space is pretty much exactly as the name would suggest. It's a bucket that lets an organization segregate everything within an Octopus server. So they push their projects, environments, life cycles, accounts, certificates, variable sets, everything down into a space. And to give a sample look at what the UI might look like, you'd be able to jump between the various spaces that you had permission to within an Octopus server. So earlier in the year when we were talking about this, we were talking about spaces at the same time as ODCM, and a space was synonymous with an Octopus instance. We backed away from that, so a space now is, spaces are all within an Octopus instance. So they're purely a virtual segregation of data, logical. You can do all this within a single Octopus server. You don't need to install multiple Octopus instances. So what might the HTTP API look like for spaces? Space just becomes a segment of our paths. So it feels about right, that top one there. Referencing individual entities won't require the namespacing with the space because they already have a unique ID across the server. And the goal here would be that for backwards compatibility for customers' existing scripts, for example, an Octopus client interaction, that it would all be backwards compatible. So if no space was provided, it would just assume the default space. And on install, we will put all their existing data into one default space. So this should hopefully keep everything working for a customer the way it would today. And if they never have a need for spaces, they will never know that the spaces feature is there. Once they decide to take a project and move it out into another space, that's the point that they'd have to deal with updating scripts, for example, that interact with the API, which feels like a much nicer time to deal with that on migration. So spaces feels nice. It feels pretty easy to explain. It solves a lot of problems. Unfortunately, we can't really do it without interacting with permissions in some way because, oh, I mean, we could leave the permissions model exactly as it was, but that doesn't feel right. The whole point of creating multiple spaces is segregating your data. And the first thing that a customer is going to want to do along with that is segregate the permissions to that data. So we could just add a space as a scope, as a project or project group or an environment are today, but our current permission system is, as anyone who's worked on the front-end refactor knows, is sort of straining at the seams a little bit already. So Paul had already given some thought to this, and spaces seems like perhaps a good chance to rethink the permission model as well. So what would the goals of a new permission model look like? We would want them to hopefully be transparent so that people can better understand what the permission model, what they have access to. Delegation. So at the moment, for example, an Octopus administrator can do everything on the machine. It would be nice to be able to delegate the responsibility for a space to somebody else, and the Octopus admin of the machine doesn't have to necessarily have permissions to that space. and hopefully to simplify the current model a little bit too. So a quick recap of what we have today. We have permissions, which are really just the object and the action that you can do to a project view. We have roles, which are the groups of those permissions wrapped up together. And we have teams, which map those roles to users. And it's this last one where it gets a little bit confusing, I guess, because, for example, if you want your testers to be able to have access to deploy projects in the test environment, but only to view projects in the production environment, then you have to create two separate teams for those. You can't do that with one team because the roles are scoped at the team level, which in practice results in people having to be a member of many teams to get the fine-grained permission set that users want. So enter groups. Groups are purely collections of users. Unlike teams, they define nothing about what that user can do. They map directly to the external groups from Active Directory, and there would be the two built-in groups similar to the built-in teams today, Octopus administrators and everyone. One of the things that makes things complicated today is the fact that once you start restricting view permissions, things get weird. For example, if you can't see the production environment, does that make sense? Should you not be able to see its name written anywhere? If you have a life cycle, can you not see production as one of the stages in the life cycle? To resolve these kind of issues, if you have permissions to view a space, you can see everything within that space. All the projects, all the environments, variables, not sensitive variables. The three exceptions to this are the ones below. So certificate private keys, for obvious reasons, task logs, and deployment artifacts. The concept of per object permissions. So certain types of objects will have the permissions assigned on them. So rather than having to kind of assign at a global level and scope to a project, for example, it will own its own set of permissions. So the initial set of objects that this would seem to apply to the Octopus server as a whole, a space, a project, or an environment. I'll drill into that a little bit more in a second and give an example of what that might look like. So, for example, here's what the permissions for a project might look like for a set of groups. So you could, for the testers group, they might have permissions to edit variables, but scope to dev test. This should look pretty familiar to today, except that this belongs to that project rather than at a global level. The concept of an owner, so an object has an owner, and this grants the ability to change permissions on that object. So this supports the idea of delegation. So when, for example, an Octopus administrator creates a space, they can say that the owner of this space is the Acme developers team. And at that point, the Octopus administrator doesn't have to have permissions to that space. The owner then has the ability to assign and manage the permissions for that space. Obviously, the Octopus admin could give themselves that if they wanted to, but in a lot of cases, they don't want those permissions. We want to simplify the current set of permissions. So at the moment, there's CRUD permissions on every object type: view, create, modify, delete. This is realistically too fine-grained in most situations. If you can create something, should you really not be able to modify it? If you can modify it, should you really not be able to delete it? So we want to create a set of permissions that better map to the things that people actually want to do in the real world. So for example, environment would have permissions to edit machines and perform tentacle upgrades rather than having create environment, update environment, modify environment, likewise for machines. So as I have sort of alluded to already, administrators don't necessarily have everything, because in these big organizations, the people who are responsible for administering the Octopus server often don't want to have permissions to deploy a particular project to production. They're never going to do that. They don't want to be able to do that. They want to delegate those rights to a more appropriate person. So this is just a sample list of what these permissions might look like. So, and this is the object that they live on, if you like. So that this first set here is the sort of permissions that might live at the Octopus server level, being able to do things like create a space, push to the built-in feed, view tasks, create a group, and administer systems. So this is all the sort of things like managing the certificates for the Octopus server, managing nodes. The permissions on a space might look something like this, and you can see the bottom one there can be restricted to environments. So library variable set edit, for example. Let's do a quick little walkthrough and see what this might look like in practice. So Alice is Alice administrator who creates a new Octopus server, and she initially is a member of the Octopus admin group and has permission to do the things on that server, like create spaces and administer that system. So then we come along and we create a project and a bunch of groups to go along with it. And so then a space is created for that, and these are the permissions that might exist on that space that's created. So you can see the various groups there have been given a various set of permissions against that space. So none of this is global. And at this point, the Alice administrator can delegate the management of this whole space as well. So then if we come along and we create a few environments within that space, now we can come along and scope some of these space level permissions to environments. So for example, we say the Acme developers, we want them to be able to edit certificates, but only for the dev and test environments, and likewise for variable sets and accounts. And again, similar concept, now we come along and create a project, and this is again all on this project now, and we scope the various permissions and assign them for the project that we've just created. So you can see the testers there can deploy releases for the test environment. And if you look at the set of permissions at the top there, then you'll see they're a little more, I guess, real world, hopefully, than what the previous ones were. So you can automatically view anything, so we don't have to worry about the view permissions, and we're assigning things based hopefully on what people actually want to be able to do. So permission migration, this is still a little bit of an outstanding question at the moment, but this is where it gets tricky. So the best that we can do here is attempt to map the existing permissions to the new model, and it will obviously come with a caveat that we'll explain exactly what we've done to the users and let them, I guess, view it before and inspect it and see if it is what they expect, and update it. I think communication is going to be a big part of the migration strategy. But I mean, in general, the existing permissions, I don't think will map too badly to the new permissions, but there's no doubt that will make someone unhappy along the way. By moving permissions around, it will have an impact. But that is something we're going to look at in more detail, over the next few days as well, have a drill into the migration of the permission models a little bit more. So that's all I have for that. Are there any questions about this?